Hi, I'm Seamless, and today I want to talk to you about modern drum mixing and my approach to it. This video is called Modern Drum Mixing, but my approach to it is pretty much just mixing and mastering everything. But I've set up here a particular example of a thing. I'm going to play it. It's pretty loud, but I hope I leveled this right. Anyway, playing in 3, 2, 1. So the goal that this little moment represents here is the idea that I wanna show you my approach to mixing when I want drums to be in the front. So for lots of modern bass music-y kind of genres, which sounds like, okay, well, wouldn't bass be the focus? But the loudest elements in all of those songs are always going to be the kick and the snare. Depending on certain ones that are a little trippier, the kick might just be the loudest element, but typically speaking, kick and snare, as long as it's kind of a broken beat genre. Anyway, like you can kind of see what's happening here with these two little automations going on here. These two pretty guys are pretty much the things that do the most work. I do have like a lot of like jazz going on here, and this is my instance superior drummer. I don't have toms in here, and you might think that a video talking about drum mixing might show you like how to mix toms into things when you want to have fills and whatnot. And the greatest piece of advice I could ever give you about mixing fills into things is to just not make your fill by itself. Listen to some songs that have really good fills, and listen to how those fills tend to happen in moments with not the louder elements alongside them. There might be some bass, there might be some like effect or whatever, but they're probably lessened or high passed or just reduced in some manner, or sometimes just nothing at all. It's the drums by themselves, because it's really hard to mix toms. Like, you basically have to treat them as individually as kick drums and mix them accordingly if you want them to come through the way that toms are supposed to. Or you just do them by themselves and then they come through like you're supposed to, because there's nothing else to fight them with. For the main stuff, though, we've got our kick and snare, which are the two main things. And then we have all this other bullshit. And, like, Superior Drummer is designed, and tambourines. Superior Drummer is designed to be treated more like a regular, a drum recording, but you can also really mess with it like you would, like, typical sample stuff. I'm doing minor amounts of, like, splitting and things inside it. This is a stack of 2 different kicks, and, like, this is a stack of some snares or whatever. You can put your own samples inside Superior Drummer 3, by the way, which this is, so, like, you don't really need to even rely on the things that they have. But this video is really not even about that. It's about what's happening after that once you split it out, and master it. So, speaking of master, here's what this all sounds like without the sidechaining that's ducking all the stuff together, and without the master on the drums, and without the master on the master. And real quick, here's what that sounds like with all the stuff on. What? So, the idea here is that I've sort of began top down. This little vignette we're looking at of just like a moment and a drop is actually pretty much how I start songs. I begin writing it with the hardest, heaviest moment. And I want to say that this is really, like, this is still true for just about any other genre, any other kind of music, but for this kind of super loud stuff, this is mandatory. Because you basically do not know how anything in your song sounds until you have every one of these elements. Until you have all the heaviest stuff, all the kick and snare, all the ambient stuff, so that you know how it's going to have to react with it. Lead elements, so that you know how it's going to be split from things. The main basses and how they switch into different together, so you can hear how they're going to mix together. You need to have all that in there so that you can mix and master it, so that you know how it feels. Because the feeling is really a big element in all of these songs, and like, people are trying to figure out why their songs don't sound real when they try and write these things like a traditional song by doing like a pre-master and then like mixing that without compression and then running that into like a limiter after you've already sort of made it a way that's supposed to sound right. Like, that works for a lot of genres. That works for even loud things, but for like really neuro stuff, any kind of drum and bass, dubstep, any sort of kind of step of any kind, really, like, this is the best way to approach it. And the reason for that is this stuff I'm doing on the Maximus on the Master here. There's some complication, but the only thing that's happening that really makes this shine the way it's supposed to is this automation right here on the release time. I set this to just be a little bit of a curve, and I did have soft saturation engaged in here for this, but because of the automation I was doing, it was throwing the cleanness out of whack, so I had to use a limiter on the outside of it to get it to bring it all together. But the point is, this was all set very generally, and then I went and did stuff. I went and added things, and the reason why this works is because when you add things and make changes to it with the generalized master on it, you end up tailoring your content to the master versus what you typically do, which is start with content and then tailor the master to it. And because like a lot about what people like, in my opinion, I think a lot of people like, and a lot of this kind of music is an effect of what the master does to stuff. And to that end, you have to kind of prep your stuff to behave in an appropriate way. So this is all very results focused. We're kind of like starting with an end result and then tailoring within that to get the actual like song. So let's talk about that end result. In the master up top here, there is actually a specific thing that I'm looking for in the playback here in the low, the mid, and the high. In my split, I make the split. Why isn't it showing? Let's pause it. Yeah. So I made the split to represent the kick and the snare. This is like this is how you do a drums focused kind of thing. Like the drums are the most disruptive elements. Especially on the master, like the drums are the things that are going above the limit and that kind of thing, and everything else is more or less mixed fine to stay below all that. If it weren't for the kick and the snare, there wouldn't be a lot of like the need for this kind of thing. Like that's why it's all drum focused. So to that end, we're focusing on the most disruptive elements, which are going to be the fundamental tones of the kick and the snare, which are the loudest things in your song, if you're doing it like this. So I have the cut to represent that, and then I'm looking for a kind of behavior. It looks like that. I say it looks like it because I don't really care about what dB level this is or what dB level that is. I just want to see a consistent shelf that represents the sub in your song, and then a consistent, like, much higher level of, like, that is the kick. And the purpose for this is basic dynamic range. This is the idea that, like, you have a sub frequency that is the note in your song, and you want to have that there and do its thing, but then when the bass and the kick happens, you want it to be an event and not just more bass. You would think that it not being a tone would be enough to distinguish it from the sub, but you don't really hear sub. It's like... not at least not a lot, and not most people. So to that end, it comes across as just kind of more of the same if it's the same basic level. You can get away with crushing it, to a certain extent. A lot of the songs in the 2010 to 2013-ish time, especially mine, were kind of crammed like that. But on like dynamic range, people like there's science behind it, and dynamic range is cool. And I'm always talking about sausages and like loudness wars and whatnot. But just because the end result is going to be a sausage does not mean that, spectrally speaking, we cannot have dynamic range. Another benefit of doing this like this is throughout the rest of the mix, you should have high passed just about everything that isn't a kicker or a bass to the end that, like, I made this curve in the low end here, but I didn't need to do that. I should have just been able to, if I needed to change dynamic range, to just turn up the bass or turn down the kick so that, like, either way that those two things change in level, and that's all that can happen. The big holes that are in here are the sidechaining that occurred, the ducking rather. For the automation. And then, of course, in the mids and the highs, you can see that the fundamentals of the snares are way higher than everything else. And then the transients that exist in the high frequencies from those elements are also way higher than even the other elements that are in the high frequencies. And of course, it all adds up quite a bit to being considerably loud, but very dynamic. This is actually a super duper dynamic mix. And that we accomplished this through some strangeness, because you heard what the mix sounded like. You heard what that sounded like before it went into the master. And there's no way, if I didn't have all these effects on there, that I would have chosen to do stuff like that. That I would have, like, known that level of stuff would have done that. This is really an analysis focus. Like, I'm looking at the results and going, okay, I need to do whatever it is I can think to do to make it look like that. And of course, it's very utilitarian. Like, I was talking about the high passing thing. Like that's not a very sound designing. That's not an arrangement thing. That's not a musical thing. That is... You don't want to have to deal with the low end if you don't need to. That's a very utilitarian thing. It has nothing to do with the music of it. And that's what a lot of this is. And it all also comes back to what I was talking about the automating the release time. If you didn't really catch why it mattered that I automated the release time, let's talk about that. So, any given kick. We'll begin as a high frequency event and then go lower fast enough that it sounds like an impact. If you look at any kind of impact, even snares or in real drums, you'll see that kind of in like the higher frequencies to the low frequencies. Why this is important is because this particularly low frequency is not all that fast in real life, even though it is still a note, it's still a tone, and we're treating it as such. And as a result, when you compress it to a certain speed that's faster than that, which is not difficult because, again, it's not very fast, it starts to change its shape, which will distort it. So if you've ever like had a nice clean kick, had a nice clean mix or whatever, and then you go and you compress it, and then you compress it so that like the impact sounds good, but suddenly like the tail is breaking, and like other clean things are breaking. Clean stuff breaks when you compress it too fast, so you have to compress it slower to appropriately, adjust for that content. For something like a kick, that is like the fullest spectrum thing that can be happening, and especially at the levels that we're doing it for a song like this. That could be problematic because you can have a static amount of compression that sounds good, but it won't sound good for the whole thing, and it won't sound good for everything as far as it relates to it. So, of course, other plugins like Ozone and actual hardware compressors have automatic release changing like control, but it's automatic. At least I think it is inside. I guess you could automate it like I do here if you're doing whatever, but like it has intelligent release control is what I think it's called, IRC, and it has various speeds of it. And that's still like static setting, but it's still kind of doing what this does, which is that it sort of tunes the compression speed to the content. The analysis version, I'm pretty sure it just reads what the average frequency level is, like frequency spectrum usage is, and then times it to that. But what we're doing here is I am automating it in time with a clip when the kicks and snares happen. So there's no guesswork. There's none of that. It's just I moved this until it felt right after the fact, and then I went all the way down so that it is compressing the thing. Like here, you can see it happening like with this automation clip. Pardon me. There we go. Here it is. So you can see this automation clip here. Like down here is the fastest with the highest frequency stuff, and then it slows down as it slows down. It doesn't slow down like completely perfectly, and this isn't the thing I'm using, but like that's what the kicks look like, and so it works that way. Combined with the ducking that this represents, this is carving a hole not just in the audio for the stuff to fit in, but it's also conforming the compressor to compress according to the right content at the right time. This has so many awesome effects on this. Like, you might have thought, like, when you first discovered sidechaining, how, like, oh, so that's how rhythm, no matter what you do, you can impart rhythm on the stuff because your drums are always putting their rhythm on things if you're going to sidechain it according to the rhythm. And as a result, like you had a certain amount of freedom of sound design because you didn't have to necessarily worry about certain things clashing at certain times because you're just making it not do that. It's kind of like that. And the benefit of that is that like you're able to kind of like not have to be an engineer all the time because you've taken care of a lot of those problems by introducing the sidechaining, the ducking. Same thing is for this release control business. We're taking away so many problems by doing that. And this lets us like do some things that you might have thought was a bit difficult before. Like, have you ever made a halftime beat of any kind and then double timed it and then had to just not work at all for your mix because its impact on the sound, on the mix and stuff was tied to it as a sidechaining thing, like a real sidechain, like to the actual source audio, which meant that if you played it faster, it still took the same amount of time. So that meant that it might overlap, it might have been too much, just too a lot. But look what happens when I play this guy faster. Even at that crazy speed, every piece of impact is preserved. You can even kind of hear the content still, even the weird quiet stuff. And that's happening because we're doing this in time with automation, it's scaling according to time. So if you did this with a halftime mix and then you decided you wanted to double time it, the content would adjust for it accordingly. That's why I love automation versus using audio as sidechaining for ducking. And of course, controlling your release time like this opens up a very interesting world in the way that you can use something like Maximus. You can do this with any kind of compressor, but Maximus's kind of shaping business means that you can use the time to have it apply itself to shapes that you might not have been able to do before. It might not have made any sense. But the end result is that I was able to use this guy to kind of like coordinate the time of the compressor actually compressing, and then I used a separate thing to actually like put the hammer down. I forgot it was fast still. Of course, this slow, you can see just how much like dynamic range and negative space is still preserved despite being so freaking loud. I mean, it's loud to me. I'm actually reducing the level quite a bit and recording the video so that I can talk and listen to it at the same time and not destroy people. But this project, by the way, it's available in the description if you want to look at it. So when you, if you want to review it for yourself, if you have Superior Drummer, because I used the regular Superior Drummer samples, then you can try it out for yourself and see how loud it is for you. Yeah. So that's really like the kind of the biggest gist is like do all the regular drum stuff, but then like if you make an appropriate sort of surgical preparation for your kick and your snare, you kind of put whatever you want on top of it. Like for like provided you have the right sort of arsenal for your drums. Let's talk about that. And this is really basic. Like there's nothing to do with like what kick and snare. It's just about a really vague genre of stuff. So I'm using these tambourines, which are just shy of being very like the highest of high frequencies because I also have these sort of like hats going on, which are also in the other overheads. And but like, you know, that's just the crash and the rides plus like the stereo version of the hats. That's the mono version of the hats. And then here we have these guys, which sort of like fill the spectrum down plus have different rhythm. And then it goes farther down with the crashes. This is basically the same thing as an overhead, slightly different instruments in it, just so that I have a slightly different color in the stereo spectrum. And the point of all of these guys is that without the kick and the snare, like these are the most like unthreatening drums. They have no weight to them whatsoever. And I want to point out that we're analyzing it. We're analyzing it right now with the mastering on. We're doing it with the thing I have going on the drums, the thing we have going on in the master. I bring it up because, again, without any of this stuff on, how would you know how to condition this stuff to behave this way? Especially since it's not even really behaving this way. Like, we listen to this stuff by itself. It's not represented like that in the mix. Like, it is crushed and blown away by things like the snare and the kick. You might be wondering what I'm doing on this master to be doing anything, and like this is mostly sound design. Like this is a kind of a textual change I'm doing to things, and not really because I thought it needed it. And especially like I'm just letting the top go. Oh, I'm using the soft saturator. That makes sense. So the point I'm making though is that like pretty much regardless of what you're doing here, like you have all your high frequency stuff, and then you have your kick and your snare. And then all the high frequency stuff I talked about before about isolating it properly in the high frequencies, like you saw there's actually a couple of errant low frequencies in there, probably because of some clipping, but like it's all to ear and to taste too, of course. The focus is that like you just want to, whatever kit you create, if this is your goal, you're going to kind of separate that stuff into those sorts of categories, not just in terms of spectrum of like here's bass, here's mid, here's high. There's also like here's the louder things, here's the not louder things. And how you treat the not louder things is different than how you treat the louder things. For example, you notice how in here, when I mute the ducking, let's go put it back up to the correct speed. And why not also change pitch? You can still hear this guy, which is, of course, because of the lead, and that's important. But we can also hear this guy. And that's just because I really liked hearing, I did actually like hearing like every hit on the note versus it getting blown away completely. And you can see how I'm doing it. I'm routing it into the ducking and I'm also routing it into the master. Just parallel processing on that. And like, that was just, I decided it needed to be represented more in the mix. And like, you have to remember that we're not just talking about a spectral mixing of things anymore. It's also like a time of like what can and cannot exist during the moments that are being blown away by your sidechaining, and what can and cannot exist during moments that have faster or slower compression. Most things get blown away completely, even the more main things like the basses and whatever. But sometimes some things need to come out, and when that happens, that's how you do that. And the reason why that's able to work, like, because you'd think that like, well, all right, everything is this crazy high level stuff because we're putting all these big holes in it. And then if you put one of the main basses into the master like that, aren't you really defeating the purpose of it? And the answer is, yeah, we are. But we're mitigating that completely with this whole release time management thing. Because if it was just kind of clashing in there and without any monodugging or like other things were, um, there would actually still be kind of like the impact preserved when the switch happened. It's because sometimes the switch itself is just a nice impact, but also in time with the real impact of drums like that, even if there's competing things going on, if the time itself changes with it, it doesn't really matter because you still get you get the impression of that event having occurred. God, that was hard to explain. I really hope that made sense. Anyway, that's how I approach drum mixing, which is to say, from the beginning, things that are to be focused on drums have to be begun with a focus on drums. That's really kind of makes sense when you think about it and you say that out loud, doesn't it? Anyway, if you have any questions about this, please let me know. This project is available to download in the description of this video, and as usual, please have a nice day.